I hope you all enjoy our evening together, learning more about lichens. My name is Manuela, and I have prepared maybe 45 minute talk, but I'm very chatty. I hope I will try to go through as fast as I can, but please, if you have questions, you can type them in the chat. And I've also included some games, so I hope you enjoy. Thank you all for being here. And I don't know the Galveston Bay area, but I've heard wonderful things. So I hope I can be in that area sometime soon. So let's start with what are lichens. And lichens is something actually quite difficult to define, especially because there's not a one size fits all description to lichens. I like to describe them as a multi-species symbiosis, and that's composed by a primary fungus or microbiome, a primary algae or cyanobacteria, the photobiont, along with a complex community of microorganisms, summarized here as the microbiome, to form what we see in nature as the lichen thallus. So um, I like to say this sort of like slowly and separately, because if you really think about, lichens are unique in that sense that you don't see these individual components separated. You just see the lichen as a whole, as this body. And what we see in nature, it is the resulting structure of this structure, being formed by all of these organisms growing together. And the way a lichen is more or less organized is that there is an outer layer that is formed by hyphae, and then an algal layer then being formed by this photobiont, which is making photosynthesis, and then more layers at the bottom that is made by cells of the fungi. And even though this is a diagram, this is a real image how the hyphae of the fungi are completely wrapping around these cells of algae. And they are a symbiosis. So what are they getting out of this? Symbiosis literally means living together. And as I mentioned, there are more than one thing living together. The fungus is bringing to the lichen protection. And this is especially for what I mentioned previously. If you remember the slide, the algal layer is sort of below the fungal, like exposed parts to the air. And this is creating a more stable environment that if the algae was simply free living, just being out there exposed to the elements. And in return, the algae is making photosynthesis and then sharing its sugars with the fungi. So simply here as food. And the other organisms that are there are primarily microscopic bacteria and fungi that we usually cannot see with the naked eye, not even in a microscope for like routine purposes, but they have lots of functions, a lot of them unknown. So think about that. Lichens have microbiome, and just like us humans, we have microbiome, and different bacteria are present, for example, in our skin than in comparison to our gut. So it depends on where they are, they will have different functions. And lichens are considered a fungal lifestyle. And by that I mean that this is one of the nutritional strategies that have been adopted by fungi. Others that you may encounter, for example, if you go on hikes, you see a lot of fungi decomposing some of these logs. If you like bread, for example, or maybe even some of your beverages that you're enjoying right now, you know that fungi can also be yeasts. They can also be parasites, and we hear a lot about bad fungi, but we also know there are a lot of good fungi. And the difference is that then in parasites, these fungi are feeding off living matter as opposed to decomposers that are living off dying matter. Then there's also multiple symbiotic lifestyles in fungi, mycorrhizae, lichens, and endophytes. And the rock stars today are going to be the lichens. And I just wanted to reiterate this, that lichens then are going to be the resulting of this symbiosis, what we know as the lichen thallus. So a lot of the times you see me using one of these terms, primarily thallus, and this is what it means. It's just that this structure that we see in nature. And then you must be thinking, how is a lichen named? And this is the first time that I want your participation. So do you think a lichen is named based on the algae, based on the fungi, or based on this unique structure? So I'll give you some time.
I guess in the chat, right? That's how you want your
Yes,
answers?
if you could please just, don't think too much. What would you think? Meanwhile, I want to respond that the algae is primarily green algae. However, about 10% of the lichens are also partnering with cyanobacteria. And there are rare events that they can partner with brown algae, if I'm not mistaken. But 90% of our lichens, green algae, and then 10% cyanobacteria. Okay, so we see a lot of responses, and let's see if you responded the fungus, you got it right. And this is going back to what I said, that lichens are actually a fungal lifestyle. So the fungus that has taken up lichenization as a nutritional strategy, they cannot survive without the partner, and therefore they take the name of this structure. So even though a lot of people responded the structure, it's still correct, because without because the fungus is always going to create this structure, otherwise, and for that they need to find a partner, otherwise they will not survive. So we'll talk more about reproduction a little bit later on.
So it's a trick question. Both answers were right.
Yes, I would say
Yeah.
that everybody's really following along, so that's important. But when I say, I included that because when I say there are 20,000 known species of lichens, I really mean that there are 20,000 known species of fungi that are able to lichenize. And just by looking at these images, we can see that they're hyper diverse, so many different colors and textures and structures. And hopefully you'll learn a lot more about those. Where the lichen is growing is very important, and what we call the substrate. And you might already be familiar with this term because it's used in other areas of biology. And you've probably seen that many lichens grow on soil, rocks, bark. This is a very common vision in the tropics, for example, that lichens and bryophytes and even other plants are growing on leaves. But lichens can also be part of our daily life. Just when you're walking on the sidewalk, if you ever seen these usually yellow and orange that look like paint stains, when you go up close with hand lenses, for example, you see that they're all being formed by lichens. And this is actually very common here in Fort Worth, for example. On a weekend we were walking, and then these guys are just everywhere. But this is already hinting that lichens are not only found on natural substrates, but also man-made substrates, including in this old car here. And they live in all different environments, not only in this beautiful, pristine tropical forest, they're also able to live in extreme environments. And this picture is from the Southwest. And you can imagine that I found it gorgeous, beautiful. However, to live there under that constant sun, it's not easy. So lichens are able to withstand environments where not a lot of other species can. And they also can grow in very unusual places, such as this cemetery. And you've probably seen a lot of lapids, with lichens growing on them. But sometimes you can also see certain lichens, broadly known as reindeer lichens. They can also form these very long carpets. I think it's just simply gorgeous. But good for us, lichens can also live in urban environments. So you really don't need to go that far to study lichens. Why are lichens important? But I don't have all day because I could tell you a lot of things. So I'm going to restrict myself and just mention a couple. And if you're interested, you can always ask more questions. They're responsible for primary production, nitrogen fixing for those that have cyanobacteria. They're also involved in the process of rock weathering and as pioneers or colonizers. They serve as food for many animals, and the list is long here, so you see a lot of different insects, but also for mammals. And this is the one that I learned about most recently, and this was just like a couple years ago, that these snub nosed monkeys in Asia, they spend most of their lives in the canopy, and up there they find a lot of these lichen here known as old man beard, usnias. So imagine if something would happen to these lichens, these animals would also be highly impacted because this is their primary source of food. And of course, the reindeer too. So here you can see reindeer eating just piles of lichens where there's not much else available. So it's really important for them as well as a food source, especially in winter. They also may serve as home for many invertebrates. And this is, for example, because lichens have these like 2D or 3D, and then it's forming all of these microhabitats that animals can make their homes and, for predator-prey interactions. They can also be used as nest building material for over 50 birds in North America. And here I have an example of a paper that I work with a colleague at the Smithsonian. So these are his pictures that he took from these hummingbirds. And then you can see here the nests are completely covered in lichen fragments. They also serve as background for mimicry. I hope you can all see this grasshopper here, or some people also call leafbug. And this is one of our games. I am challenging you to find, there are two pictures. There is a spider hidden in each one of them, and see if you can find it. So I'll give you a couple of seconds there. Okay, can you all see it? So the one on the left, you can sort of see a little like some hairs, while on the right seems like more like a shadow. Okay, so I do see some responses. So it's right here if you haven't seen that one. And here is the other. So here are the legs. All right, so if you found that was easy, how about this moth? Can you spot the moth in this endemic palm species from Jamaica? Give you a few seconds. Okay, I found this one. Everybody was walking by, and then suddenly I'm like, wait a second, there's someone trying to hide here. So if you haven't seen yet, I'm gonna bring it up close, and now it's it's much easier to find, and it's right here. And just a quick comment that I like to make about this, because this moth is actually mimicking a pattern, this pattern of mosaic that is created by the lichen. and that are growing in the trunk or the bark of these tree species. And these lines that you see, these black lines, they're actually separating one individual lichen from another. So you can see here, for example, this black line is called a Protalus, and it's an important character. So I like that the moth is mimicking this pattern overall. So right there, okay. And then lastly, and this might be the most difficult one, again, an example of Usnea lichen, and then you are looking for another insect there. This is harder, huh? Let's see how's the chat. All right, so it seems like some of you have already found it. If you have not yet, let me show it to you. It's right there, okay? So I usually find this by the antennae right here. And here is the body of the animal, completely camouflaged. Lichens are also important for consumption. And this might come as a surprise for some of us because we really, at least I didn't grow up, knowing that you can eat lichens or use lichens in other products. And these are some of the products that we humans use lichens. So this is a dish here, and you can see here some pine nuts. Here's another dish, and this is actually from my plate. And I ate this little piece of reindeer lichen, and it was very crunchy. It was deep fried, so some people say that anything deep fried is good, but I'll leave that up to you. And then there's also some they call these in Germany lichen bonbons, or just it's sort of like a cough drop. And then it's very important in Iceland because they make this Icelandic schnapps. So I actually had a time where like 2 or 3 different uh, friends went to Iceland, and each one of them brought me these. And you can see the schnapps, and then this sort of things inside here. These are pieces of lichens. Lichens can also be utilized for natural dyes. And then, for example, here in these cards, you see that there's a piece of lichen, the name, and the dyes that the person got from these lichens. And then also they have been historically used as material for cosmetics, especially perfumes. Lichens, I would say, are most utilized by humans as bioindicators. And you might have already heard about this. And the story behind this is that this research actually started being performed a long time ago in like the time of industrial revolution, that they noticed that with the increase of air pollution, some lichens started to disappear. So what we know now is that there are some lichens that are sensitive to pollution while others are tolerant. So it's important for us to know what lichens can be utilized as bioindicators. There are some lichens that do just fine if the nitrogen, if the sulfur dioxide, if ozone are high, while others are really sensitive. For example, cyanolichens, they are some of the first ones to go when the air is polluted. And a lot of people ask me about lichenometry, or or are lichens really slow growers, or how long live lichens. So I recently started adding a little bit of this in my talks. And what we usually heard is that lichens are extremely slow growers. And that is because most of the research being done in this area is in polar deserts. So the lichens there are usually very slow growers. But in contrast to that, early colonizers, such as this species of Peutigera that is found several different species here in Texas, they may grow a lot per year. And they might not be growing as fast as a plant. Now is the spring. Sometimes you plant a seed, and in a couple of days you already start seeing the seedling. So maybe it's not that fast, but they're still cannot be considered slow growers. And another example is the California state lichen, the Ramalina menziesii, that may grow up to 90 millimeters per year. One of the main things that people ask me is, what is the coolest thing about lichens? And this is one of my answers, depending on my mood, is their crazy chemistry. And why I call it crazy? Because just look at them. They can have so many different colors. And this is because lichens may produce over 1,000 different compounds, and a lot of them are exclusive to lichens. Some of these are used as sunscreen. So remember that algal layer that is being formed by the photobiont and being protected by the fungal component is then in high sun exposure. For example, in this lichen right here, there are these pigments that help and act like a sunscreen. Other components may act as water control or inhibitory for small organisms. As I mentioned, a lot of organisms like to eat lichens. So lichens were like, let's make some acid so we don't taste that good. And maybe not so many animals eat us, right? So evolutionary speaking, this has going on for millions and millions of years. But the way I see this is that there's so many new possibilities to cure or treat diseases for agriculture. And for example, there are some of these lichen compounds that are being utilized in cancer research, and they apply these lichen acids to see if this cancerous cells, if they even sometimes if they not completely go away, but if they don't grow as fast and so forth. And the results are very promising. So that's very exciting, which makes our job as taxonomists and systematists, or putting names onto lichens, very important, because not all lichens have the same compounds. And some of these compounds may fluoresce under the UV light. And as you can see here on the left, we have a picture of a tree trunk that has all these white crystals lichen. And again, as a taxonomist, there's not much I can do to name these because I don't visualize a lot of the characters that would allow me for identification. However, with chemistry, we can at least see that these are 4 different species. So again, this is a white light here on the left, and on the right we have UV light, and it's showing that each one of these lichens have a complete different chemistry, and they're all UV positive. So let's talk about the types of lichens. There are primarily 3 types of lichens. The first one, the crusty or crustals, the one that we just saw, they grow very closely attached to the substrate, and you usually have to cut if it's a bark, or use chisel if you want to remove them from rock. And sometimes they look like a paint, like that sidewalk one that I showed before. There's also leafy or foliose lichens that have the formation of these structures here, lobes, that are more or less loose on the substrate, okay? So you can still have multiple points of attachment, and these levels may vary. So there are some that are much more closely attached, some are very loose, but they are all, if it resembles a little bit of like a leafy lettuce on the borders, they are usually foliose. And then there's a third main type that is called fruticose, and these are like branching or hair-like or bushy. So before we move on, I also want you to remember that the underside of the lichen is important. So I know a lot of you must be on iNaturalist and you want to identify things. So if you have a big foliose lichen, it's important that you also take a picture of the underneath, because here we have, for example, a lichen that was more or less gray, greenish from the top, but it's brown with white dots at the bottom. You could never have seen that if you haven't looked at on the underneath. And here, the top part is brown and the underneath is white and has these veins here in black. So just a few tips for the future if you want to start identifying some of these lichens. And they also may have several special characters, such as these cilia, which are very resembling of eyelashes. So again, they can be in the borders of the lichens, they can be in the main surface, they can be sort of not so dense to very dense and so forth. Let's talk about lichen reproduction. And lichens can disperse primarily in two ways, sexual and asexual. And sexual will have several different structures that what we see are the spore-bearing structures or fruiting bodies, commonly said. These fruiting bodies can have many different shapes. If they are more or less round, like the ones that you see here from the top and here from the side, they are called apothecia or buttons. If they are more or less elongated and resemble like squiggly lines, they're lirelli. If they are more or less pear-shaped or from the top, you just see a little a pore, these are perithecia. There are other forms such as mazidia, and however, they're not so common. So usually what you see, or if you really want to identify this lichen, you need to cut these structures and also observe their spores. This is, so before I was explaining with diagrams, this is real photos. And then here we have an example of buttons, of pimples and scripts. And as you can see that they are of multiple colors. And even though crustose forms can have lirelli, perithecia, and apothecia, generally the ones that the lichens that you see out there here are going to be apothecia, because they're also the only types of fruiting bodies found on fruticose and foliose lichens. So crustose can have them all, but foliose and fruticose just buttons. And then on the opposite, we have asexual spores. So now is the time to also explain that. So before, in the sexual way, there are the production of spores. So remember that a lichen needs a fungi and a photosynthetic partner. In that case, the spore needs to germinate and then find a suitable partner. In this case, in the asexual reproduction, it's already the combo package that is released. So even though all of these combo packages may have hyphae and cells of the algae, they can have multiple forms. If it's powdery, it's called soredia. If it's finger-like, it's called isidia. If it has small little thin lobes on the corner of the lobes, it's called lobules. There's also pustules, that are like bursting into these structures that are being released. And then there's also just parts of the lichen that may fragment and create a new lichen. Let's see some of these photos. So finger-like, again, look very up close here. And you were thinking, oh, I was thinking something much bigger. No, these are usually very tiny and you need good hand lenses for this. So here then we have the powdery ones and the lobules. So the easiest way to separate this, the powdery ones, if you touch it with your pinky, for example, you get a little bit of powder, you know, like you ate a donut, you have a little bit of powdery sugar in your hand. And I have a good story that you might, as naturalists, you already have probably hand lenses, but if not, it's a very good investment. And I remember in one of my first bio blitzes in DC, I made a key for this area that I was leading, and I kept telling people the difference between Isidia and Ceridia, and people were like, "I don't see it, I don't see it," and I'm like, "Okay, let me take a look with your hand lenses," and then I saw that they had just uh, plastic cheap hand lenses, and those were not good enough to separate these structures. So I understand if you have challenges with that, and that's why if you're really interested in lichens, it's worth investing in good hand lenses. And by investing, I don't really mean super expensive. There are some good ones on Amazon for let's say $20 already. And then you bring specimens back in the lab, and then there's as I mentioned, you check out the fruiting body and the spores and so forth, because they can also be very variable. We also do a lot of chemical spot tests, and these are, some of them are very easy to get. For example, the bleach or C test is just a household bleach. And then you can see here in the top image, I have a lichen that is very similar to the previous one that had the Isidia. We scraped off the outer layer to expose this white part of the thallus that is just the fungus, and we put a tiny little dot of bleach, and this is what happens. It has this very red reaction. So in this case, I would say it's C positive of bleach positive red. And this is indicative that there's acids present that are allowing for these reactions. So same thing with other types of chemicals that we use. The C reactions are usually pink and reds, while the K reactions are usually yellow and orange. And then we also have a third one, and this one might be more difficult to get, but sometimes it's very important, especially for some group of lichens. So this is the lichen ID cheat sheet that I made, and I'm happy to share with you all. But just as you know, a summary, where the lichens are growing, it's important, the growth forms, the reproductions and structures, if it has any special characters. Um, Usually for a lot of the macro lichens, so these big showing lichens, you can already get to a name. However, for crustose lichens, you usually need anatomy for that. Chemical spot tests are very variable, and there are some groups that you're able to really narrow down the species, while some you need some chemical tests. So now it's another game, is what type of lichen are you seeing here? So we have number 1, 2, 3, and 4. So if you can put on the chat whether you think one is folios, crustose, fruticose, same for number 2, 3, and 4. So let's see if you remember what types these are. And then here are some cheat sheets. So these are forms of crustose lichens. This is a foliose or leafy lichen, and these are fruticose or branching bushy lichens. Okay, so meanwhile, what power hand lenses? I would say at least 10, 20, or 30, but the important part is really the quality of the lenses. So no for plastic lenses, yes for better quality lenses. So, and then the reproduction part, when we're talking about the reproduction of the lichen as a whole, so in the asexual is both of them being released together, a little bit of some cells of the fungus, some cells of the algae. However, in the sexual part, it's a spore. So the spore is just going to belong to the fungal component, and then this fungal spore will germinate and then find a photobiont. Okay, so we have several. And here are the results. Number 1 is fruticose, 2 and 3 are crustose, and 4 folios. So it seems like you all did really well. Life is not that simple, however. Aside from these 3 main types, there are some sort of subcategories, all right? So some foliose lichen, they can also be known as jelly lichens because they have their photobiont to the cyanobacteria nostoc as a partner. So if you've seen free living nostoc in nature, you see that they're this like blobby, very jelly-like structure that is being formed by the nostoc that is free living. But that inside of the lichen talus is usually going to give you a very similar vibe. Okay, so right here you can see this lichen right here, this phisma. There's also some lichens that are just filamentous, and you can see these little threads of these structures, and each one of these threads actually has the cyanobacteria or the green algae, and then so individual unicellular cells that are just packed together, you know, like a coin pile, and then being wrapped by cells of the fungi. There's also dimorphic, as the name say, 2 forms, and that is because it's a fruticose vertically, and then horizontally can be crustose or squamulose, which can also alone be a type of lichen as well. And squamulose, you can think of small fish-like scales. So just some common lichens that we see out there just to get you started. You've probably seen a lot of these tape lichens. So these fruticose lichens, they're usually more flat. They're called Romalina. We also have these usneas that they're round and sort of elasticy. They're called usnea, also old man's beard, in general beard lichens, and also cladonia or cup lichens, but they really can have so many different forms that there's also many common names for these, like reindeer lichen, British soldiers, cup lichens. Some common lichens that you might see just on a daily basis, you might see a lot of these Phaceaceae, which are foliose lichens that have very narrow lobes, and a lot of the species can tolerate pollution, so it's very common sighting in urban areas. Other common lichens can be cladonias. Sometimes you're only going to have the primary talus, so not forming that secondary structures, and they're going to be a lot of these just being formed by squamules. It's very hard to find a species name if you only see this. And of course, the Parmeliaceae, the big shield lichens. When people usually think about lichens, they think about Parmeliaceae. And then Peutigera, also here, they're usually much darker than Parmeliaceae, and they have these brown or bluish colors here, also common in Texas. Some bright lichens now. So Candelariaceae, it's a family that has these very yellow lichens, and they may have different forms. They could be crustose, they can be foliose, and they can also be fruticose. Loberiaceae, it's usually just found in areas that are not so polluted, and they're gonna have this almost unusual color of lichen that is this bright green. So lichens don't usually have this bright green color, and usually if you do, in big foliose forms, they're going to be Loberiaceae. And then Teloschistaceae that also has these yellow and orange forms. And actually, excuse me, fruticose forms of this color are usually Teloschistaceae and not Candelariaceae. My bad. Some common crustose lichens are usually graphis. So these script lichens, the squiggly lines, they're usually belonging to this genus. Hematoma, as the name says, it has this like blood color in their apothecia. Right here, several species of hematoma in Texas. It's one of the most diverse places for this genus. Acarosporas, they have this like very interesting, sort of almost crackled talus structure with these dots, which are the apothecia, which are sunken. And then Lepraria, it's resembling of this very dusty overall lichen. So it's not only one structure that is dusty, it's the entire lichen that is completely leprose, they say. So summary of awesomeness, lichens are incredibly diverse. They're very well represented in the fungal tree of life. A lot of different fungi have evolved to become lichenized. They're models for the study of symbiotic associations. Lichens are classic examples of symbiosis, but we really don't know that much about them. So it really provides a lot of interesting questions for us to keep researching. There are a lot of lichens out there. Remember, I said about 20,000 known species of lichens, but a lot of them still unknown, and not a lot of lichenologists. And they also provide unique chemical compounds not found anywhere else in nature, and they're broadly used as biomonitors of air pollution. With that, I would like to leave some resources if you're really interested into lichens. I would say that here in North America, the big major book is still Lichens of North America from Brodo 2001. There is an updated version with keys. There are several academic publications. You can get engaged in iNaturalist. There's also, beyond the observations, there are also several guides for certain areas. The U.S. Forest Service has great resources, especially about lichens and how they're utilized as biomonitors of air quality and so forth. My main website that I love is called Ways of Enlightenment, and it's right here. And I just love it because it's very friendly. I'm not from Texas, so I also had to learn, and I'm still learning a lot about the lichens from here. And Ways of Enlightenment is a great website because you don't have to know all of those names, all of those structures that I showed you. I just really wanted to give you an immersive experience to see how diverse lichens can be, but there are a lot of resources out there, and Ways of Enlightenment is one of them because it's separated by some of these structures that you see, So you might not remember what an apothecia is, but if you remember that a fruiting body has this sort of like button and round, and you saw that in the lichen that you're trying to identify, you click there. Or if you see a lichen that is bright orange or yellow, you can go into the flames, for example. With that, I would like to thank you all so much, especially Mike, Maureen, and Chuck for helping me with the setup of this talk. And of course, the entire Galveston Bay Area chapter for being here. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Manuela. We have got some questions for you.
So I can maybe stop. Okay, I think I'm out of my screen share.
Okay, so I'm going to ask if they would like to unmute and ask them themselves. So the first are the Wrights. Would you like to unmute and ask your question? It was kind of towards the beginning.
Sure. So she answered our question already. She said that 90% of the bacteria were greens, and then probably 10% maybe.
Bacteria.
I'm sorry, of the algae.
The cyanobacteria. But
Yeah.
what about reds and browns? Are there any representative?
I think there's a very few citations of those, so maybe one or two that have been included, which is already surprising. So there's a lot of research to be out there. However, there are very few and almost exceptions to those, but they are represented.
Thank you very much.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, the next question. Derek, would you like to ask your question?
Yes, you had mentioned, you were talking about the moth that mimic the black lines that separate the two types of lichen, and I was curious whether you could describe that that feature in more detail.
Yeah, so that is called a Protalus. Not all lichens have them, but you could clearly see in that image that most lichens did have them. And that is just a part of the thallus that is formed just by hyphae, so just by the fungus, and it's usually pigmented. So you saw that it was like a black line, and it's just the definition of a lichen. So a lot of lichens will form those, and we don't really know why it's there. It can be for competition, you know, as the lichen grow, it moves, but it's primarily formed by fungus only, and it has and in that part of the fungus, or that part of the lichen only, it's producing this black pigment.
Okay, the next question. Martha, would you like to unmute and ask? Martha, if not, I can ask for her. She was asking about the hand lens, what strength? What?
Oh, yeah, I mentioned I have a 10 one, I have a 21. So the most important that is that plastic, it has to be just high quality glass lenses. So when you're buying, you can see that. And another cool feature is that some of them have a light. So when you go really up close to a tree, for example, if it has light, even if you're making a shadow, you can click on the light, and that's a huge help.
Okay, the next one is Emily. Do you want to unmute and ask Emily your question?
I think I also responded that question already, but Emily, please, if you still have more questions, if I didn't respond to your satisfaction, please let me know.
Okay, then the next one would be Verva.
First, I just want to say thank you, Manuela. This was awesome. Thank you. You mentioned that some of the lichens thrive when the pollution is very low, and some of them thrive when there is more pollution. Do they use them as a diagnostic for pollution? I know there are some water animals that are used to kind of monitor the quality of water.
Yeah, so very similar idea. The U.S. Forest Service has thresholds for clean air, you know, or polluted air utilizing lichens. And that is not so uniform throughout the country. For example, there are already very well-established lichen species that are indicative of good air, for example, but that's in Texas. I was looking and I couldn't find like a list of species, but we can try to apply what we know from other states here. So yes, this is exactly the same idea, that some lichens cannot tolerate nitrogen. So if the nitrogen level in the air rises, these lichens are gonna go. So I don't know if I mentioned, but for example, cyanolichens, they are some of the first ones to go. When I lived in DC, I saw once or twice one, so very rare. Here, I haven't seen much in the city either. Fruticose lichens can also be more sensitive, but then again, it depends highly on what the species are and the community shift that you have overall. So what they do is that, again, lichens, they do not get nutrients from their substrates, but from the air, you know, aside from the sugars from the algae. So they're absorbing what's in the air. They don't have a cuticle, so everything is absorbed, and then it will highly affect the metabolism of the lichen. So if sulfur dioxide or ozone is high and they cannot tolerate, they will die.
So they're a little bit like the canary, huh? And
Yes, and exactly. So then people, there's like employed, and they're employed lichenologists by the government to make this research. So it's one of the areas that the U.S. is very advanced and known worldwide, excuse me, because of this type of research. I don't know if we.
Great answer. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, we have one last question from Nancy.
Yes, I was wondering about we called them shelf lichen that attach like a shelf to a tree in the woods.
That is wonderful. I mean, I haven't seen those here in Texas. So if you have pictures of those and you're interested in or willing to share with me, I love those. I'm actually very biased because one of the work that I've been doing, they form exactly that. So there are two major groups that form shells, and they resemble mushrooms, right? But they do have this association with algae. And the two main groups there are is Cenogonium, which has green algae, and they're very felty and like forming, as Nancy said, shells. But there's also the group that I work with. It's called Gyptonema, and they have cyanobacteria as their photobiont.
Okay,
But they are considered filamentous lichens.
I was living in North Carolina at the time that we saw them. So
Beautiful. Were they more green or more blue? Do you remember?
no, kind of, they would have like layers in the shelf, stripes around, kind of.
Okay, so maybe they were actually just fungi and did not have algae in them.
Okay.
But again, there could also be lichens with that aspect. So it's possible, or you know, we'll have to see. But they're really cool. And as I said, I'm a big fan.
Thank you. Very interesting.
Thank you.
Okay, I think that's all the questions that we have. We
Mhm.
have a ton of comments in chat, though. We had 80 people tonight for your presentation. Great presentation,
Thank you.
fascinating, wonderful, very interesting, lots of wonderful comments.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. I do see a few raised hands, and I wonder if they have questions too. I don't know if you
Okay, we can
you
see
them?
Mitch.
Yes, I've loved lichens ever since I went to Enchanted Rock State Park, and what I'm wondering is, you know, that it looks like some, you know, abstract artist went in there and painted all the rock before I got it. Is there any rhyme or reason to the different colors?
Yeah, so evolutionary speaking, this is connected to a lot of these different colors are connected to these different pigments and acids produced by lichens. So in that slide that I have, you know, like they can be used as sunscreen and water control. That's why there's this production of these pigments, and we actually don't know a lot about them. So we know some of them, and especially the ones that are yellow or orange, they are utilized or they are produced by the lichen to protect the algae from high sun exposure, for example. But we don't know a lot about the others. So And I had another picture right by on that slide too that had like red. No idea why that red is there. So there are a lot of people that think that it could be for, especially because the red is on the border, that it could be a benefit for competition, but there's really not a lot of research done for that. So I think there's a lot of potential there for futures and many future generations of lichen study.
That's good. That's good. Thank you.
Okay,
Thank
we
you.
have one more hand and there's no name. It's 148518. If you have a question.
Okay, this is Lynn Smith. I don't know why that number is coming up high. And my question has been answered. Thank you. It was an excellent presentation. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Then we are done. We can all hang around and visit with each other, but we would like to thank you again so very, very much.
Yeah.
A lot
Thank you
of
all
interest.
so much. Yeah. Sorry to cut. I just
This is
wanted
Maureen, and Linda Davis just rushed in there and put in one last question. I'm sorry, because you probably didn't see it.
I can see it. Do they hurt the surface that they're attached to? No. So that's a great question because even my mom sometimes say, there's too many lichens growing on these trees and they're like ruining my tree. And I'm like, Mom, no. And I'm like, we have to like this fight. I'm like holding her because she wants to remove the lichens. But really the lichens, just thinking and reviewing again, they're not using the substrate for nutrients. They're, sharing the sugars from the algae to the fungus, and then they're also getting these nutrients from the air because they're absorbing these from the air. So they're not actually, even though lichens may have structures that look like roots, which we call rhizines, they're just being utilized for attaching themselves, but they're not absorbing anything like the roots of a plant would. So they're totally safe. If you have them on trees and in your property, just enjoy them because they're not going to hurt that surface.
Well, that's good to hear. So we can always like lichen when we see it.
Yeah, I mean, there is a little bit of a fight with like people that are conserving monuments, for example, and I've worked with people that are more in the conservation side of monuments, and they don't like that lichens are growing there because it changes the appearance of lichens, and lichens do have like sort of enzymes that can create this surface of like dust, and these enzymes may break a little bit of these rocks especially, and that's in the process of rock weathering. So that's the main debate about lichens being there. But in natural substrates, I would say that we're totally safe. So I still try to convince that the monuments or lapids are prettier with lichens, but I can't convince everybody.
I like it.
Thank you, Manuela. Again, it was amazing. We've all learned a lot. We all enjoyed it. And I think I'm going to
Wonderful.
turn it back over to Pam.
Thank you so